Thanks for coming to the Photobook Review YouTube channel. We have an Instagram account now, and so if you want to follow along there, I'll post snippets and previews to the next book that's coming up. And please, with this YouTube channel, like, share, and subscribe. I've really enjoyed answering comments lately and people pointing out things in books and photographs that I hadn't thought about before, and that's the best thing that could come from something like this. This week we're reviewing Deep Springs by Sam Contis. There are some really cool themes in here of masculinity, of independence versus community, and kind of a time capsule. So let's dive in. So here we have Sam Contis's Deep Springs. So this book was published by Mac in 2017. This is a library copy. The book goes for a lot now. It's been a very successful book, like a lot of Mac's books. But before we get into it, I think there's three distinct themes in this book. I think it's the big theme is masculinity, a study of masculinity. There's a lot about independence versus community in this book. That would be the second theme. And I also think this book is kind of a time capsule. I'll explain that further, but first, this book is a record of Sam Contis going to photograph a college, a school in Deep Springs, California, which is right on the border of California and Nevada. I think it's technically a 4-year school, but it's usually a 2-year school for the students enrolled, which until 2017 were all men. And in 2017, they actually went co-ed. 26 students a year come into the school. It's a very small school, but it's 26 students who manage 200 cattle and 155 acres of alfalfa farm. It's actually right near Death Valley. So it was a school started by an electricity magnate. His name was Lucius Nunn, and it was founded in 17. Sam Contis ventured out to this school for 4 years, for weeks at a time, photographing her time with the all-male student body in a very rugged landscape. Her images, kind of the style of them, are often mysterious, and they're also very tight shots. So this is a good image to talk about right here. It reminds me of modernist styles of photography, where you would have a standard or a telephoto lens that's really getting at the heart of something. A better example, maybe a few photographs in. This is a found image. Sam Contis discovered a vernacular photo archive at Deep Springs towards the end of her photographing, and she incorporated it into the book in the later stages. So this image here is an image that looks like it was torn from a scrapbook, and it says, see if I can read it for you, part of Deep Springs Valley from something view or something mountain. It's a great image to talk about landscape. Sam Contis talks about the idea of the West, and the West is where things are reinvented and things are discovered, whether that's resources or people. Think about people moving west to try and discover or try to find wealth and prosperity, and the landscapes they encountered along the way. And so the setting that this is the West is not lost on Sam Contis. In fact, it's very specific. And going along with that, Sam Contis is thinking and photographing that what's being reinvented in the West in this school is masculinity. one of the interesting aspects of this book that she talks about in interviews is that in a place like this, there are several different forms of masculinity going on. So here we have, someone tending crops, and then it looks like a past student, looks like maybe writing, or maybe they're surveying, but there are abstract images in there, like this book. Something that I took away from researching Sam Contis is that she talks very well about the metaphor of photographs, that photographs can be metaphoric. And photographs are a visual language in their own right, that metaphor or abstractness or interpretation is inherent to them. It makes them different than verbal or written language. And so there shouldn't be an attempt to directly translate a photograph into verbal or written language. It is a photograph. It is a language itself. Anything other than the photograph would be a translation and maybe something lost. Something that struck me about this book as well is it kind of felt Sternfeld-esque in his book Sweet Earth, where he's photographing utopian communities. Sam Contis talks about this as kind of a utopian community in that things are being reevaluated and discovered. Not that it's utopian in that it's all one sex, but that they're progressing towards something. The idea would be different kinds of masculinity. And I think something that's interesting to this image pairing does a good job at indicating the physicalness of the students there, kind of brawn and working with your hands to kind of tame this harsh landscape. There's a variety of gestures in this book from the models that she's using. Sometimes they're gentle, like holding plants. Sometimes they're violent, like slaughtering cows. And sometimes they're affectionate. And sometimes they're rough and tumble. Sometimes they're tough. And it mirrors the landscape very well because the landscape is harsh, though dynamic. Deep Springs has an aquifer beneath it. Just a really simple but a beautiful view of the landscape. And I think in an interview with the magazine that I was reading, Sam Contis talks about not wanting these photographs to be read as enforcing a stereotype, that this book is not simplistic. Sam Contis didn't want this to be a simplistic view of masculinity, though she says that we like to simplify things in our head, but this book isn't investigating a certain simple kind of masculinity. It's not investigating on the one hand a violent masculinity or an overly sensitive kind of dandy kind of masculinity. More historic footage. There's a mixture of black and white in this photo book. So Sam Contis talks about photographing both with digital cameras and 4x5s and other formats, and that's one thing I actually really appreciate about this book is the multiple formats and color schemes. I really love this photograph. Talk about modern. I think it's a successful example of color photographs and black and white photographs being used together because it almost goes unnoticed. If you're not told that there's color and black and white photographs included in the same book, you wouldn't notice it. I think oftentimes I meet other photographers or students who want to know if they can include black and white photographs and color photographs in the same portfolio of book. And I say absolutely, but you have to know what you're doing. You don't want it to feel like two separate bodies of work. You want it to feel like a cohesive body of work that has black and white and color photographs. So I've spoken before, there's themes of coinciding themes of the male body and the landscape, and male affection and familiarity that is sensual but not sexual. Sam Contis talks about the nature of running this college is very physical, and it puts these students in close proximity to each other, and a familiarity like you might find between family members. So like we saw that wrestling image before. Contis also talks about this page turn actually. These three boys either licking rocks, or it almost looks like snow, but I think it's salt, or it is licking stones to identify what kind of stones they are, which you might do if you're a geologist. But this page turn going from the boys to the upturned horses bathing in the sun, the humanness and the wildness of the landscape. This photograph reminds me a lot of a Thomas Eakins photograph, or a painting rather, boys swimming in a pool, except here you don't see any of their faces and it's not from the same perspective, but you get these gestures, and also you'll notice it's a pretty tight shot. Clothes hanging out to dry. It's a great photograph. The model's head just above the horizon. I think that's symbolic. It's very heroic. Just a great example of how powerful a simple black and white photograph can be. Pardon the aside, but I'm continually fascinated by the power of a photograph. The power of a still image, framed or matted or printed on paper. It's just, it carries so much weight. This is a great stopping point to talk about another theme of this book. Sam Contis, in finding these archived photographs on campus, discovered that these were photographs that the boys were making while they were there, and pointing out that photography has been, since the time of the college and since the time of going westward, photography was a way to understand the environment and to understand yourself in that environment. And later on, there's photographs of boys from the 1920s and 30s photographing barren landscape, the desolate landscape. And that's something that's always gone on. It seems almost human nature that we want to, I mean, it's an old argument that we want to document our existence, but it's even more powerful when you see evidence of it. So here we have a kind of a rigged up telephoto lens. We have a view box camera with some binoculars up against the lens and getting these kind of landscape photographs. Kind of an ingenuity that we want to see, and we want to see the landscape. There's a lot of these photographs that Contis is making that mirror the male body, mirroring a landscape. See these? You can almost see these as being shoulders, and then the backbone, and then the small of a back. And then when you turn the page, you actually see this landscape in flesh. I think it's a great, clear-eyed investigation of a male body that doesn't skew towards a preconceived idea. The male body is documented and compared to the landscape. Just like it has, you think of Edward Weston in his photographs of his girlfriend out in the desert. This reminds me actually of a Sam Abel photograph that he gives lectures on. He's found the photograph so powerful. In Sam Abel's photograph, it's cowboys branding a cow And here we have the students pinned down, but it just feels so gesturally. It feels like such a decisive moment. We have this figure with his face covered, but the horse covering it. Look at that great arm, relaxed arm swinging over. We don't see much of anyone's face here except this man. I think that's something you notice a great deal in this book is you don't see many of the men's faces in the book. You see their bodies. And you see their bodies interacting with each other. This would be a bag. I guess it could be used for a lot of different things, but usually to deliver a calf or to inseminate an animal. A bag, protective bag that someone would put over their hand. Another example of a landscape of a man's body compared to another landscape. So the independence and community aspect of this book, the second theme I mentioned, is that there is vulnerability and there's violence in this book, and there's definitely lots of hands. And so that sweep of the back, that delicate tone of the skin, something feels vulnerable and private. You're seeing bare skin. And then something violent. Oh, you see the two boys' faces. Slaughtering animal, slaughtering a cow or a steer. And there's so many hands involved in this work. But it reminds me, I think, this reminds me of another Edward Weston photograph of his son's torso. It reminds me, the hands and the vulnerability and the violence in this book, that living is labor. Living is hard, especially in an environment like this. And that's something that Sam Contis wants to communicate, that what you're doing all day isn't necessarily working to earn a wage, to buy things. You are working to eat. You are working to farm from the landscape. You're working to grow cows and steers, that your survival is directly dependent on the work that you do in a day. And I think to be active in a community, that community needs independent people who are self-sufficient. So you see in a small communal, self-governing, I might add, institution in Deep Springs, you need rugged individuals. You need people who can carry their own weight and then go the extra mile to provide for everyone else. Sam Contis says that, or rather Deep Springs and Sam Contis say that most of the students that transfer after doing this school for 2 years go on to Ivy Leagues. They go on to Stanford, they go on to Columbia, Yale, they go out to Oxford, Harvard after their time at Deep Springs. And that Deep Springs looks for a particular type of student who sees value in putting themselves to the test like this. This is the only image like this in the whole book. It's a double page spread, full bleed image, 3 men on horseback out in the wilderness. It's a great shift in the book. Here we see again hands, something violent and vulnerable at the same time, that pink in the skin. A hand being active in the photograph, a hand being passive in the photograph. So this book is a time capsule, including these archived photographs. gives this work a breadth that contemporary photographs might not be able to do. It shows a long history, kind of like Larry Sultan's Pictures from Home, him including family footage from previous decades. Gives a larger sense and indicates a larger history of the family. Hair trimmings from a haircut. You can see the comparison of the male's form with the landscape there too. The cracks in the earth, the folds of the skin. You also see indentation here, or maybe scars. I think the found images also show a self-awareness of the students. They have always been using photography specifically to understand the landscape around them. And it's a great happenstance, or it's a great product of hard work that Sam Contis found these archived photographs. Kind of as a watch geek, I love seeing all the Casio watches from the hands in this book. And I imagine a watch somewhere like Deep Springs is an actual tool because they're so isolated. They're probably not carrying cell phones on them to tell the time, and the watch kind of comes back. Another photograph of an active hand and something violent going on. Sam Contis talks about this photograph a lot, particularly in the way that she's photographing masculinity in this book. You have this kind of goofy, flirty, self-aware photograph that this boy posed for. That this image is right next to an image like this. Something active, and then something passive, as though they're being observed. I also just think it was such a worthwhile investigation, and so clear-eyed and genuine, open an investigation to study masculinity in the different forms it has, and in such an isolated landscape. Sam Contis talks about wanting to photograph this specifically. She was trying to get a portrait of this individual, and he lifted up his hair to get it out of his face, and she saw that kind of architecture, that body shape, and wanted to photograph it. And look at the photograph that's right before it. It's almost the negative composition. Another Casio. This is a great 3-image series. It looks like they are pushing along some irrigation pipes. You can kind of place them in the landscape. You have these, I think this is one of the most effective and kind of humorous page turns. You have these two men trying to push it along, and then you have this guy at the end of the line watching. You'll also notice a lot of blank pages in here, and I'm happy to see them because in a 2-page scenario, we're not looking at a scroll, and so there's 2 pages to fill or not to fill. And when you have an image on a single page, there's not an image that's working in concert or conflicting with it, and you just have the image and it places a certain importance on it. It's great page designs and page layouts in this book too. Sometimes they're going into the the gutter of the book and coming back out. Another example of hands doing something gentle or doing something active. Sam Contis has this page layout that's kind of like a constellation of images. And sometimes you'll see the archival photographs kind of sprinkled throughout the page. Here we have a man sitting below, or sitting in a garden and writing. Compared to this archival photograph. Here's a great example of a constellation of images. I hesitate to even over-explain them because it would kind of go against Contis's idea that this is a visual language. I do love this photograph though. This is the only photograph of a woman in the entire book. And so I'm not sure if this is Sam Contis or if this is someone else. The school is run by both men and women. And I'd be curious to know if this is Sam Contis or not, because if it is, I wonder why she included this image. I think in my own photo book, sometimes I'm tempted to include self-portraits to visually include myself in the work. And I wonder if that's what she's doing here, and why maybe she's turned away. Maybe in keeping with the other photographs where so many figures are turned away, but what a blast of a photograph. All this texture, this great color, kind of timeless, barefoot, sweater, skirt or dress, harsh landscape. There's another photograph of kind of male closeness, and I think a indication that all contact or all sensuality is not inherently sexuality, and so touch shows familiarity between people. This is a great image because of the nail polish and the multiple hands being in the image. Again, there's so many photographs emphasizing the hand, and it's something kind of hospitable and gentle going on. This is a great photograph. Just a single head looking up. We do know in interviews that Contis had some level of role, at least in the sequencing of these photographs. I would imagine a larger, more than a smaller role. I always kind of wonder that, because with a publisher like Mac that's so successful and involved, as I understand Michael Mack is really invested in these books, I often wonder at what level did the photographer have input in sequencing or have input in page layout, because often the medium is the message in those things. The design of things shape it so much. This is the back of a scrapbook or an archival photograph, which says greenest grass is in the deepest mud. And that's a nod that there's water under the surface there, but it is hard to get at, and it's not so pretty to look at initially. It's a great metaphor for the book. All these skins, or materials rather. Another image, these hands kind of holding the entrails of probably a cow inside. You know, these students are taking classes in literature, in survival, in what they used to call it husbandry, so running a farm. Just like the color of his skin against the gentleness of these sheets. It's really powerful photograph. So this book, or this image, is a powerful one to put towards the end. This is an archival image, or an archival image of a boy being photographed while photographing. And so that there's an awareness by the individual who's taking in the landscape, and then the individual photographing the person taking in the landscape. I kind of wonder, why are we surprised that we love photography so much? It enables us a sense of permanence, and it shows that we value things, that we have questions about things. Sam Contis talks about this image and the meaning behind it, and I hope I communicated it clearly. This photograph of the landscape, a bit more fertile, a bit more green, but all the clothes are off the clothesline. Luckily, or funny enough, this is a signed Sam Contis book that's checked out from the library, published in 2017 by Michael Mack at Mack Publishing, Mack Books. And in here she thanks the students and the faculty and staff at Deep Springs. And there's these great pink end papers. But Sam Contis, Deep Springs, some excellent themes and worthwhile questions to consider. I see this as justifiably from Sam Contis's explanations, I see this as an investigation of masculinity, a conversation between independence and community, which might sound like a paradox, but I don't think they are. And this book is a time capsule showing the history of a place and how it's always people who live there have always tried to understand themselves through photography and relate to the landscape through photography. Sam Contis, Deep Springs, excellent, important, thought-provoking, dynamic book. So awesome book, Sam Contis, Deep Springs. What are some of your thoughts about Sam Contis defending photography as a visual language, and kind of playing down or challenging that need for over-explanation? Share your thoughts down in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and there'll be more soon.